The security badge slipped from my fingers and clattered across the floor of the elevator. I didn't pick it up right away. I just stood there watching it spin slowly on the polished marble. The photo on the front showing a version of me who still believed that doing excellent work was enough. Donna from reception crouched down and handed it back to me without making eye contact. That told me everything I needed to know about how fast word had already traveled through the office. "Thank you," I said. She nodded and walked away quickly, the way people do when they're afraid your bad luck might be contagious. My name is Nadia Chen. I'm 36 years old, and until 11:15 on a Wednesday morning in March, I was a senior analyst at Callaway Meridian Capital, one of the most respected mid-market investment firms on Bay Street. I'd spent 8 years building something real there. 8 years of 70-hour weeks, of getting in before the cleaning crew and leaving after the security guard had already done his second round. 8 years of turning down offers from competing firms because I genuinely believed that the work I was doing at Callaway mattered. Before we go any further, I want to say something directly. If you've ever been the person in your family who did everything right and still ended up with nothing to show for it while someone else took the credit, this story is for you. If you've ever sat across from a performance review and heard the words "not the right fit for advancement" when what they really meant was you make the wrong people uncomfortable, this is for you too. And if you've never had that experience, consider yourself lucky and keep listening anyway, because it might be someone you love. The box they gave me was too small. A shoebox, essentially, which said something about how seriously they'd planned for this moment. My desk had accumulated 8 years of carefully chosen items, a ceramic mug with the University of Waterloo crest that my mother had given me when I got the job, a framed photograph of my late father and me at Niagara Falls, when I was 12. The small potted lavender plant I'd kept alive through 4 Toronto winters on a north-facing windowsill, and the leather-bound notebook I'd filled with 3 years of market observations that nobody else had thought to write down. I packed everything methodically while James from HR stood behind me talking about the severance package, in a tone that suggested he'd memorized the speech from a manual. Something about 8 weeks' pay and maintaining my benefits through the end of April. COBRA equivalent under the provincial plan. He kept using the word transition as though my career were a caterpillar about to become something beautiful. What he didn't say, what nobody said, was why. Restructuring. That was the official word in the letter. A departmental restructuring that had eliminated my position. 23 people on the trading floor who'd watched me work for 8 years pretended to be very busy with their keyboards. My assistant, Paulo, had tears in his eyes and was clearly under strict instructions not to say anything because he kept opening his mouth and then closing it again like a fish. I carried the 2 small box to the elevator, rode down to the lobby, walked through the glass doors onto King Street, and stood in the March wind for a long time before I could make myself move toward the subway. My sister called before I'd even reached the platform. "I heard," Victoria said. "Dad would have been devastated." I noticed she didn't say she was devastated. I noticed the past tense, as though she'd already processed the whole thing and moved on. Victoria had always been efficient that way. "I'm fine," I said, which was a lie, but the kind of lie that keeps you functional. "Of course you are. You're always fine." A pause. Ethan wanted me to mention that there might be something opening up at Morrison Whitfield in the fall. He could put in a word. Ethan. My brother-in-law. The managing director at Hargrove Capital who'd introduced my sister to every important person she'd ever met and who had, over the past 3 years, slowly and methodically ensured that every significant relationship I'd built in the industry became a relationship that also ran through him. "That's very kind," I said. "Tell him thank you." I didn't tell her that I already knew Hargrove Capital was where the restructuring decision had actually originated. I didn't tell her that the senior partner at Callaway who'd signed my termination letter had been Ethan's squash partner for 11 years. I didn't tell her any of that because I'd only just started to understand it myself. And because one of the most important things my father ever taught me was this: never let the people who are counting on your silence know that you've started to find your voice. The apartment felt too quiet for the next 10 days. I applied for EI employment insurance, as is the right of every Canadian worker, and received the confirmation email from Service Canada with the kind of bureaucratic cheerfulness that makes terrible situations feel surreal. I updated my resume. I reached out to former colleagues. I took long walks along the waterfront in the cold, watching the ice break up slowly on the lake. And then, on a Tuesday, my phone rang with a number I didn't recognize. Nadia. The voice was Gerald Paxton's. Gerald had been the founding partner at Callaway Meridian for 30 years before semi-retirement, the man who had personally hired me out of graduate school, the man whose framed photograph hung in the boardroom alongside the other founders. "I need to speak with you in person. Not at the office. Are you free this afternoon?" We met at a coffee shop on Queen West, the kind of place that's been there long enough to have character without trying to have character. Gerald was already seated when I arrived, which told me he'd been nervous about being seen coming in. He was 72 and had the look of a man who'd been carrying something heavy and had finally decided to put it down. "I didn't know," he said, before I'd even taken off my coat. "I want you to understand that. I was in Florida. By the time I heard what had happened, the paperwork was already processed." I sat down slowly. "What happened, Gerald?" He told me. "The research." That was where it had started. For the past 18 months, I'd been building an analysis, a comprehensive, deeply sourced, original analysis of undervalued infrastructure assets in the Mid-Atlantic and Ontario markets. 200 hours of work, minimum. Proprietary modeling, original source interviews, a framework that I'd developed myself over years of watching how these markets moved. I presented the preliminary findings to the partners in November, with my name on every page. In January, while I was on a 2-week leave following a minor surgery, a revised version of that analysis had been presented to the firm's largest institutional client by the head of the Alternative Investments Division. With different formatting, with a different name on the cover page. My brother-in-law's name. "Ethan rebranded it as a Hargrove Capital white paper," Gerald said quietly. He presented it as collaborative work. The Callaway partners didn't push back because he brings them a considerable amount of referral business. When you came back from leave and started asking questions about the timeline, it created a situation that certain people felt needed to be resolved. They fired me to protect him. Gerald looked at his coffee. "The official position is restructuring. But the real position..." He didn't answer, which was its own kind of answer. "There's something else," he said. He slid a printed email across the table. A message from Ethan to 2 of the Callaway partners, dated 4 months ago. The language was careful, the way language is when someone is being careful about plausible deniability, but the meaning was not subtle. Nadia's perspective on growth projections is increasingly out of step with where the firm wants to go. There are also concerns I'm hearing from people in the industry about her professional judgment. I wonder if it's worth having a conversation about fit. I read it twice. "Where did you get this?" I said. "I have 30 years of relationships in this building," Gerald said. "And I've spent the last 2 weeks being very politely furious." He straightened in his chair. "What I'm about to say is not official advice. Officially, I'm a semi-retired founding partner enjoying my winter in Florida. But I spent 30 years building something honest, and I won't sit quietly while it gets used to protect someone's vanity project at the expense of someone who deserved better." He looked at me steadily. "What do you want to do about this, Nadia?" It wasn't really a question. I spent the next 3 weeks being invisible. Gerald had arranged for me to have quiet access to Callaway's archival systems through a contractor login, the kind of arrangement that's technically permissible and practically invisible. I worked from a library on Bloor Street most days, sitting near the back with a large coffee and the focused energy of someone who has nothing left to lose and therefore nothing left to be afraid of. The analysis was the beginning. The original files were time-stamped. My version, created between August and November of the previous year, predated Ethan's white paper by 3 months. The metadata on the documents he'd submitted to the institutional client showed edits made to files that had originated on a Callaway system, on a workstation assigned to my floor, during hours when I was logged in. He hadn't been careful, because he hadn't thought he needed to be. Men like Ethan rarely think they need to be careful. The whole architecture of their lives is built on the assumption that the people they've wronged will remain too polite or too afraid to do the math. I did the math. The financial irregularities took longer to find, but they were there. A series of advisory fees paid to a numbered Ontario corporation 2847691 Ontario Incorporated. If you want the exact detail, that had no employees, no public profile, and no registered address beyond a mailbox at a commercial postal center in North York. The fees totaled just over $114,000 over 18 months, billed against 3 different client accounts at Hargrove Capital. The payments had been approved by Ethan in his capacity as managing director. I cross-referenced the incorporation date of 2/8/4/7691 Ontario Incorporated with the date Ethan had made partner. They were the same month. I'm not an investigator. I'm an analyst. But analysis is just pattern recognition, and the pattern here was not complicated. The person who helped me understand the full shape of it was Dorothy. I'd known Dorothy Osei for 8 years. She'd been the office services manager at Callaway since before I arrived, a 64-year-old Ghanaian-Canadian woman with reading glasses on a beaded chain and a habit of leaving small chocolates on people's desks when she sensed they were having a difficult week. She knew the floor plans of 3 different Bay Street offices by heart, knew the name of every security guard on every shift rotation, and had been passed over for a management title so many times she'd stopped counting. Not because she wasn't qualified, she was more operationally intelligent than half the vice presidents in the building, but because people like Dorothy are often considered furniture by people like Ethan. Present, useful, invisible. Dorothy was not invisible to me. She appeared in the library on a Thursday afternoon, sat down across from me with a reusable shopping bag, and said, "I figured out where you were working." I looked at her. "I've been the one sending the overnight mail for 17 years, she said. "I know every forwarding address in this city." She reached into the bag and placed a manila envelope on the table between us. "I've been holding on to these for about a month. I wasn't sure what to do with them. Now I know." Inside were printouts, physical printouts, the kind people make when they want to discuss something without leaving a digital record. Meeting notes from an in-person conversation between Ethan and the 2 Callaway partners who had signed my termination letter. Dorothy had found them in the shredder queue, caught before they'd gone through, placed into her cleaning cart with the calm deliberation of a woman who has watched powerful people behave badly for decades and decided, finally, that she'd seen enough. The notes were explicit. My name appeared 4 times. The phrase "neutralize the IP issue" appeared twice. "Dorothy," I said. "Why are you doing this?" She settled her glasses on her nose and looked at me with the particular steadiness of someone who has been waiting a long time to say something. "Because I have worked in these buildings for 31 years, she said. "And I have watched women like you, women who are twice as prepared and half as celebrated, get managed out of rooms by men who couldn't do their jobs without them. And I am 64 years old and I have about 8 months left before my retirement, and I have decided that I would like to do one thing before I go that I am genuinely proud of." She had access to every floor, every conference room, every printer and shredder and physical mail system in the building. Over the next 2 weeks, she became the most valuable research partner I'd ever had, and she did it with the quiet efficiency of someone who had been professionally underestimated for so long that the people who should have been watching her had completely stopped. The invitation arrived the day before my research was complete. A thick cream envelope, gold-edged. The Canadian Alternative Investments Association Annual Recognition Gala. My brother-in-law's name on the printed program as the recipient of the year's Industry Leadership Award, to be presented at the event at the Fairmont Royal York on the first Friday of April. My sister's handwriting on the note card tucked inside. "Thought you should know. Ethan will be there with the whole Hargrove team. Please come. It would be good for you to reconnect with people." I read it twice. Then I picked up the phone and called Gerald Paxton. "Are you attending the CAIA Gala?" I said. A pause. "I'm on the advisory board. I have a seat at the head table." "Good," I said. "There are some documents I'd like to share with you before Friday." The Fairmont Royal York in April is the kind of place that makes you understand why people spend their lives chasing access to rooms like this. The ballroom on the 2nd floor holds 600 guests and has a ceiling that looks like it was designed for a different century. Crystal chandeliers. White linen tables. The murmur of several hundred conversations from people who've collectively decided that the world is exactly as ordered and meritocratic as it needs to be. I arrived at 7:15, which was 15 minutes before the program was scheduled to begin. I'd worn a deep green dress that I'd bought in 2019 for a client dinner and never found another occasion for. Conservative. Professional. The kind of thing that says, "I'm not here to be noticed. I'm here because I belong." Ethan found me within 4 minutes of my arrival, which told me he'd been watching the door. "Nadia." His smile was the specific smile of someone who's decided the best defense is to act as though there's no reason for defense. "Glad you made it. Victoria was hoping you'd come." He touched my elbow briefly, a proprietary gesture, the kind that's meant to communicate I control the tone of this interaction. "You're looking well. How's the job search going?" It's going very well, I said. Thank you for asking. He studied me for a moment. Something in my expression apparently didn't give him what he was looking for, because his smile tightened slightly before he excused himself to greet someone else. My sister materialized from the direction of the bar. Victoria is 2 years younger than me and has always been beautiful in a way that's easy and unconsidered. The way some people are effortlessly musical or effortlessly coordinated. She was wearing something pale and expensive, and she kissed me on the cheek and said I looked put together, which was the word she'd been using since we were teenagers to describe my appearance in a way that was technically a compliment and emotionally something else entirely. I'm glad you're here, she said, and I believed, in that moment, that she meant it. Victoria has never been a cruel person. She is a person who has spent her entire adult life choosing comfort over clarity, and in doing so has enabled things she would have found repugnant if she'd ever looked at them directly. That's a different kind of wrong, but it's still wrong. I'm glad too, I said. I found Gerald at the head table and spent 10 minutes with him and 2 other advisory board members. I'd sent the documents to Gerald the day before everything, organized and indexed, and he'd spent the intervening 24 hours making calls with the methodical efficiency of a man who has spent 3 decades knowing exactly which calls to make. The Financial Services Regulatory Authority of Ontario had been one of those calls. The CAIA's own ethics committee had been another. 2 of the institutional clients whose accounts had been used to fund the numbered company had been a third and fourth. The 5th call had been to a journalist at the Globe's Report on Business section, a woman who had been trying to write a story about advisory fee irregularities on Bay Street for 18 months and had never quite had enough to go on. She was somewhere in this room tonight. Gerald had mentioned she'd bought a ticket. I was back at my own table, which was mid-room and had a clear sightline to the stage, when the program began. Speeches. A video tribute. The kind of evening that unfolds according to a script written by people who assume the script will never be interrupted. Ethan was introduced just before 9 o'clock. He walked to the stage with the particular ease of a man who has been told he's extraordinary for so long that he's stopped noticing the effort it takes to believe it. He was 51, polished, well-liked in the specific way that people are well-liked when they're generous with their connections and careful with their enemies. He'd built something genuinely useful in his career, I want to be fair about that. He'd also built it on top of other people's work without acknowledgement, and then, when one of those people got close enough to the surface to be visible, he decided to bury her instead of share credit. He thanked his team. He thanked the association. He talked about the importance of original thinking in a changing market landscape. He made a joke about the Leafs that got more laughs than it deserved. And then he said, with the particular warmth of someone who has rehearsed sincerity, I also want to acknowledge the collaborative spirit that makes this industry great. Great work is never done alone. He smiled at the room. The room smiled back. Gerald Paxton stood up from the head table. It was not a dramatic gesture. It was simply a 72-year-old man pushing back his chair, picking up a document folder, and walking toward the stage with the unhurried confidence of someone who built the institution being celebrated and therefore has every right to stand in its room. Gerald. The MC, caught off guard, stepped back from the microphone. Is there something? There's a matter of attribution, Gerald said, reaching the stage and accepting the microphone with the calm authority of a founding partner. I apologize for the interruption, but I think the people in this room have a right to know what they're actually celebrating. The room shifted. 600 people recalibrated simultaneously. I watched the Hargrove Capital table 8 people who'd arrived together and were now looking at each other with expressions that ranged from confusion to a dawning, terrible comprehension. Gerald did not raise his voice. He described, in precise and documented terms, the origin of the research that had won Ethan his award. He named the original author. He described the timeline. He explained the metadata. He noted that copies of the relevant documents had been provided to the FSRA, the CAIA Ethics Committee, and the institutional clients, whose accounts had been used to fund consulting fees to a company that performed no consulting. Ethan, to his credit, did not collapse immediately. He reached for the microphone and said, "This is a mischaracterization of a collaborative process," which is a sentence that sounds confident right up until you've read the time-stamped files. Gerald handed him a single printed page. The original analysis, cover page, with my name and the original submission date in the file properties. "Nadia," Gerald said, turning toward the room, "would you come up?" I had not planned to walk to that stage. That part was Gerald's initiative, not mine, and for a moment I genuinely wasn't sure my legs would cooperate. But then I thought about 8 years. I thought about the lavender plant that had taken 4 winters to grow properly on a north-facing windowsill. I thought about Dorothy, who was watching this on a live stream at home because she'd already submitted her retirement notice and was spending this Friday evening with her grandchildren. I walked to the stage. The original research had been the centerpiece of the white paper. I didn't need to speak for long. I simply described, in plain language, what the work was, what it had required, and what had happened to it. I am an analyst. I know how to present data without editorializing. The facts, arranged in order, were sufficient. My sister was at table 11. I couldn't see her expression clearly from the stage, but I could see the stillness of her body, which is how Victoria looks when she's processing something she can't immediately rationalize. Ethan's face, beside me at that stage, went through several phases. Confidence, then calculation, then a kind of compressed fury, then something closer to resignation. He was not a stupid man. He understood, by the time I'd finished speaking, that the room had shifted in a way that couldn't be shifted back. The CAIA's president stepped to the microphone and announced that the leadership award would be suspended pending a review by the ethics committee. He said it with the pained composure of someone who'd been briefed 20 minutes ago and was doing an admirable job of not showing how much he wished he were somewhere else. The security detail that accompanied Ethan out of the room was private. Not police, this was a gala, not an arrest, but it was firm. And it was public. And 600 people in the Fairmont, Royal York Ballroom watched it happen. My sister found me in the hallway outside the elevators 20 minutes later. She looked, for the first time in a long time, like herself, not the curated, composed version of herself she'd been performing for a decade, but the actual person underneath, who was frightened and confused and had a great deal of thinking to do. "Did you know?" she said. Not accusatory. Genuinely asking. "Not until Gerald told me," I said. "But I should have understood it sooner. I think I didn't want to." She was quiet for a long time. "What happens now?" she said. "FSRA will investigate the numbered company. The clients whose accounts were used have already been notified. Whether that results in formal charges depends on what the investigation finds." I paused. "Whatever happens, it won't be because of anything I did that was outside the rules. Everything I found through documented, legitimate means. I want you to know that." Victoria looked at me with an expression I hadn't seen on her face since we were children, something open and uncertain and very young. "I'm sorry," she said. "I know," I said. I meant it. And I also knew that sorry, by itself, was not sufficient, and that the work of understanding what had happened, what she had participated in by choosing not to look, was hers to do, in her own time, in her own way. I took a taxi home along the lakeshore. The city was clear and cold, and the water caught the light from the Gardner in long, broken lines. I'd texted Dorothy from the hallway of the Fairmont, "It's done." Gerald was extraordinary. So were you. She'd sent back 3 words. "Proud of us." The next morning, I received a call from the CAIA's president, who wanted to discuss rescheduling the Leadership Award presentation. He was careful and professional, and I could hear in his voice that he was still recalibrating, still figuring out what the appropriate tone was for a conversation he'd never expected to have. "We'd like to offer you the award," he said. "Given the circumstances, the committee felt it was the right thing to do." "I appreciate that," I said. "But I'd actually prefer something different. I'd like to propose that the award this year go to Dorothy Osei, and I'd like the CAIA to commit to creating a recognition category for operational and administrative leadership in the industry. Because the people who keep these firms running have been invisible at these events for too long, and that's a problem worth fixing." A pause. "That's an unusual request." "Yes," I said. "I know." Gerald called an hour later. The FSRA investigation had opened. 2 of Hargrove Capital's institutional clients had formally requested audits of their accounts. The numbered company 2847691 Ontario Incorporated had been flagged for a CRA review. The process would be long and procedural and deeply unglamorous, the way real accountability usually is. There would be no dramatic courtroom moment, no single verdict. Just the slow, inexorable machinery of regulatory consequence, grinding forward because someone had taken the time to document everything carefully and hand it to the right people. "What are you going to do now?" Gerald asked. I've had 3 calls this week from firms that want to meet, I said. I'm going to take my time and choose the right one. I paused. And then I'm going to do the work. He laughed a real laugh, the first one I'd heard from him in this whole conversation. Your father would have been proud, he said. I thought about my father, who had driven a transit bus in Scarborough for 27 years and who had told me, the week before I graduated from Waterloo, that the most dangerous thing in any room was a woman who'd stopped apologizing for knowing what she knew. He would have liked Dorothy, I said. Dorothy received the CAIA's newly created Operational Leadership Recognition at a luncheon in June. She wore a bright orange dress and gave a speech that lasted 11 minutes and contained 3 separate moments that made grown adults cry in the good way. The way you cry when something has been true for a long time and someone finally says it out loud. Her retirement party, the following month, was attended by more people than the firm's annual general meeting. I started at a different firm in May. Smaller, younger, and principally owned by a partnership that includes 3 women in senior leadership roles, a detail that I mention not because it's the only thing that matters, but because it turns out to matter quite a lot in practice. My research methodology has been adopted as a standard framework across 2 departments. Nobody has asked me to make my ambitions smaller. On my desk, I keep a small photograph. My father and me at Niagara Falls, both of us squinting into the summer sun, both of us grinning in the uncomplicated way that people grin when they're in a beautiful place with someone they love. He's been gone for 11 years. But I still hear his voice clearly when I need it. He used to say, don't wait for permission to be the most capable person in the room, just be it. And when someone tries to take credit for it, write everything down. I wrote everything down. If you've been with me this whole way, thank you for listening. If you've ever had your work taken, your voice minimized, or your ambition treated like a problem to be managed, I want you to know that the documentation you keep today is the foundation you'll stand on later. Hit the like button if this story meant something to you, and drop a comment below. I'd love to know which moment stayed with you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now. There are more stories where this one came from, and not one of them ends with the wrong person winning.